Mass hysteria. It's something you've probably heard of before, and there are several famous examples throughout history that you're probably familiar with. The Salem witch trials, the dancing plague, the laughter epidemic.
What he means is Old Testament, Mr. Mayor. Real wrath of God type stuff. Exactly. Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies. Rivers and seas boiling.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes.
The dead rising from the grave.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
And if you're like me, these are the events in history that interest you the most, bizarre instances that haven't happened before or since and will probably never be fully explained. But there's one more instance of mass hysteria that I hadn't heard about until recently, despite it being much further out of left field than any of the others I've mentioned so far. And, well, it was so bizarre that the second I heard about it, I felt the need to make an entire YouTube channel based around the documentation of obscure, weird occurrences throughout history, just so that I could spread the word that this was an actual thing that happened. This is the case of the Cat-Nuns.
Gotta walk together, gotta sing this song.
Nun. Cat-Nun.
Alone in the world is a little cat.
None. First, I should start off by elaborating what mass hysteria is for those who might not be aware. And to that effect, I should start off with the much more well-known case of the dancing plague of 1518. The basic idea is that someone took to the streets of Strasbourg, France, dancing despite there being no music, and everyone who came to see what was wrong with the young woman felt then suddenly compelled to join her in her dancing.
We can dance if we want to, we can leave your friends behind, 'cause your friends don't dance, and if they don't dance, well, they're no friends of mine.
Estimates vary on the number, anywhere from 50 to 400 people. But the idea is that eventually scores of people joined in and begged the people around them to save them, as they had no control over their actions and felt as though some outside force was forcing them to dance until they collapsed of exhaustion. Of course, there was no real medical explanation as to why they couldn't stop, and therefore the cause has been blamed on mass hysteria, a type of group delusion in which many people think something is happening, and through the power of suggestion and a groupthink mentality, it ends up becoming real to them. And that is how dozens of people danced for days upon end without food or water until they collapsed of heart attacks or just pure exhaustion. Though, as you'll see later, records weren't kept quite that well at the time. Modern-day historians question whether or not anyone died at all. Everyone does agree that these events did happen. The dancing plague happened, there were 50 to 400 people, and that brings us to the so-called Cat-Nuns, a much lesser-known case of mass hysteria, but in my opinion a much more bizarre one, and one very much worth talking about. Most sources I could find around the internet seem to confuse two separate cases, that of the Meowing nuns and that of the biting nuns, with one another, which is to say that yes, the Cat-Nuns is not an isolated incident and did in fact happen twice. Once in Germany in the 1400s, and then again in France in the 1700s most likely, but the date isn't exactly given. The more widely documented case is those of the biting nuns, which occurred in 15th century Saxony, Germany. Girolamo Cardano is a 16th century doctor, mathematician, and astronomer whose work is mainly known today for his book Ars Magna being one of the cornerstones of modern-day algebra. He is also the first known person to give a medical description of typhoid fever. Now, why am I bringing him up in a video about Cat-Nuns? He's the reason we know about them today. Modern articles on the events seem to confuse the idea that Cardano, also known as Cardin for short, was actually there and interacted with the biting nuns, but from what I understand that's not true. And I believe the confusion comes from the fact that the date isn't exactly given. Cardin lived in the 1500s, also known as the 16th century, so I understand someone getting confused along the way of 1500s and 15th century, but those are two different centuries. Supposedly one single nun in a convent in either Saxony or Brandenburg, it's not very clear which, began biting her fellow sisters, to which the other sisters in the convent began biting one another, and then it spread to other local convents throughout Germany, and then throughout Italy, and then to the Netherlands as well. An account by Johann Georg Zimmermann in 1791 stated, probably with a bit of hyperbole, that it then spread to all of the female convents in Europe. The London Quarterly Review, Volume 3, published in 1854, states that the bitings occurred at a specific time of day, that there was a compulsion that they felt every single day for certain hours of the day, and I couldn't find that confirmed anywhere else. In getting a little ahead of myself here, they do seem to also mention that the Meowing nuns would be overtaken by their urge to meow at specific hours of the day, but that one does seem to be backed up by J.F.C. Hecker's book, The Epidemics of the Middle Ages. Hecker noted that the meowing occurred every day for several hours, though no other source seems to suggest that the biting nuns somehow snapped out of their mass hysteria and acted like normal, only to go back into their biting habit for specific hours every day. Unfortunately, despite several well-respected medical experts over the next several hundred years giving their opinions on the case, none seem to give many more details on the events other than what I've just described to you. Just as an aside, in my research I had to comb through some shocking sexism as these physicians tried to blame the mass hysteria events on the victim's gender, completely forgetting that the dancing plague happened to men, women, and children alike, and that is the most standard example of mass hysteria, even the example that they themselves were using as the standard example of mass hysteria in their own books at the time. For example, the paragraph from Zimmermann's Solitude that introduces the subject starts as follows. The female mind is still more subject to these delusions of disordered fancy, for as their feelings are more exquisite, their passions warmer, and their imaginations are more active than those of the other sex, solitude, when carried to excess, affects them to much a greater degree. Their bosoms are much more susceptible to the injurious influence of seclusion, to the contagion of example, and to the dangers of illusion. So yeah, yikes. That's basically 1700s talk for women have overly active imaginations and can't be trusted to be left alone by themselves. And this was a leading medical expert of the time. And again, in this very book, Solitude, he has a very large section about the dancing plague. So he knows that mass hysteria events happen to men and women alike, that it clearly has nothing to do with their gender, but he's still deciding to blame the Cat-Nuns and biting nuns incidents on their gender. So again, unfortunately, these are the only historical documents we have surviving to go off of, and they're written like this. Anyway, a nun in a rather large convent in France began to communicate entirely through meows with her fellow sisters in the convent. Again, specifics would be nice here, when, where, what the woman's name was, and any details about her life other than the fact that she started compulsively meowing. Unfortunately, all of that has been lost to time. This spread around for some reason completely naturally and unquestioned, and came to the point where it was just the way the women of the convent spoke to, greeted one another, and communicated in general. It really wasn't viewed as a problem until the women of the convent came into town and started to meow to the general populace. And again, either the meowing was entirely focused within certain hours of the day, or more concentrated during certain hours of the day. To quote J.F.C. Hecker's book, The Epidemics of the Middle Ages, "The whole surrounding Christian neighborhood heard with equal chagrin and astonishment this daily cat concert, which did not cease until all the nuns were informed that a company of soldiers were placed by the police before the entrance to the convent, and that they were provided with rods, and would continue whipping them until they promised not to meow any more." This was supposed to be a fun video. Where did I go wrong? Right, so the local townspeople's answers to the nuns meowing was to get the French army to threaten to whip them until they stopped. These actions were praised by the London Quarterly Review, who decided that the contemporaries of the biting nuns, as well as Cardano himself, were too kind to their patients, and that this was proof that mental breakdowns should be treated with violence rather than with care and understanding. Again, may I say, Yikes. This is, unfortunately, where the story ends, as there is such little detail remaining. From what I can gather, the sisters stopped meowing and the soldiers left. No violence was actually partaken in, so it was not remotely as bad as it could have been. Apparently, the presence of the army was enough to scare them out of whatever had taken them over. Though, obviously, this is about the least ethical way to deal with patients of a possible delusional episode. So it seems to me that there wasn't anything malicious in this case. Unlike the biting Cat-Nuns, the meowing Cat-Nuns weren't hurting anyone. And calling the 1700s meowing Cat-Nuns a case of mass hysteria at all seems to me a bit questionable. From what I can tell, there's nothing implying that it wasn't a bunch of women who had nothing exciting going on in their lives, trying to have some fun for once. They easily could have believed there was some force compelling them to meow, which is the theory that both Hecker and Zimmerman both subscribe to. They believe that isolation was the cause, that living within a deeply secluded society together in the convent in a deeply heavily religious society with an added extra amount of stress is what leads normal, healthy individuals into such a group delusion. And while I think this explanation for the biting nuns is certainly the case, as well as a very likely explanation for the much more famous case of the dancing plague, I can also see a version of events where the meowing Cat-Nuns were simply trying to spice up their lives with an inside joke shared between the women in the convent. And of course, the soldiers were brought in to teach them that no fun is allowed in the 1700s. And with as little surviving information as we have, it's hard to say. In fact, such little surviving information exists, and all the information that does exist seems to be medical scholars saying, I read this in this other person's medical journal that I'm not going to name, and I'm not going to cite the journal. It's perfectly fair to conclude that none of this actually happened at all. I choose to believe that there's some truth to both cases, though the extent to which the biting nuns epidemic spread is certainly greatly exaggerated by Zimmerman. If it really did spread to every convent in Europe, there would be far more major historical figures and medical scholars talking about it than just the small handful whose records survive today. What I can say for certain, coming out of all of this research, is that I'm glad we no longer live in a world where people who say things like, the imaginations of women are always more excitable than those of men, and therefore are susceptible to every folly when they lead a life of strict seclusion, and their thoughts are constantly turned inward upon themselves, are no longer considered the foremost medical experts of our time. Share this video with anyone you know who loves learning obscure trivia, and remember, those who don't learn from history are doomed to meow, 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 meow.